We got Steve Moore from the Wall Street Journal on the line right now, and we're going to talk to him about the economy. There was sort of a troubling jobs report that came out late on Friday, and the Dow faltered a bit, and we're going to get into that in just a moment. But, Steve, before we get into that, we should point out the breaking news of the moment is that Margaret Thatcher, the Iron Lady, has passed away. Member of Parliament, Secretary of State. She was a leader of the Conservative Party in the UK and the longest-serving prime minister from 79 to 1990. In this country, when we think about conservatism, we often mention Ronald Reagan, but those two went together like hand in glove, didn't they?
They sure did, and they were the two people in the late 1970s and early 1980s who literally saved capitalism. People forget that in the 1960s and 70s, UK went socialist, right? It became a socialist country, and its economy was in a state of total collapse. And Margaret Thatcher was the one who came in and really saved the British Empire. She is, I think, one of the great stateswomen of the last century. And I think a lot about Reagan and Thatcher now, because the biggest problem in this world today is there is simply no leadership. And you look back at what was happening in the 80s when you had Thatcher and Reagan, and that kind of leadership really brought stability and growth and peace throughout the world. It is sorely lacking today. We just don't see that kind of international leadership we had back then.
Stephen Moore, when you talk about Margaret Thatcher and you think of her legacy, oftentimes they look at the labor strikes and how she stared down the labor unions there, specifically the miners, if I recall correctly. Yep. How did that really usher in the Reagan era here in America in terms of organized labor and sort of the changing of the guard, I guess, and the best way to put it, in terms of the power structure in the world economy and capitalist societies?
It's a great point. What was happening in Britain at that point in the 60s and 70s, and one of the reasons they became so poor so quickly, was not only did they turn into socialists, but they also allowed the labor unions to essentially run the government. You had a labor union-run government before Thatcher came into office for 20 years. And what happened was that Thatcher and then later Reagan, when Reagan fired the air traffic controllers, they really kind of broke the back of the organized labor movement and allowed a more free enterprise system in labor. You didn't have governments dominated by union boss interests. And that had a huge impact on the surge in the economy in not just in the United States, but in Britain in the 1980s and 1990s, one of the greatest periods of prosperity in the history of our country and theirs.
I want to turn to this report that came out last Friday, a jobs report, which was a little disturbing to many. One of the things that we found out is that apparently a lot of people have fallen out of the marketplace when it comes to looking for a job.
It is the most perplexing thing I've ever seen as an economist. We're in the fourth year of recovery. The economy is doing, decently. It's not doing well, but it's doing okay. And yet, as the economy continues to expand, more and more people have dropped out of the labor force. Now, that's exactly the opposite of what you would normally see during, in fact, sometimes the unemployment rate goes up as an economy expands because more and more people start looking for a job. In this situation, it is so odd. We've seen more and more people drop out of the workforce, so that, in fact, since this recession began, we've seen about 3 million people drop out of the workforce. If we had the kind of labor market expansion that we had, again, under Ronald Reagan in the early 1980s coming out of a terrible recession, today there would be 4 million Americans more working. That means every unemployed person in the state of Pennsylvania, Ohio, Indiana, and New York would have a job today.
Yeah, and, you talk about the job problem. When those numbers came out, we saw the White House and Alan Krueger, chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors, suggest that maybe this had something to do with the sequester. What did you see that? And what do you have a response, Stephen Moore?
Well, I laughed, as I think most people listening to this show did. First of all, it just doesn't show up in the data. There was only a few thousand people that were on that cut from the federal workforce. Actually, the big cuts in the federal workforce were in the Postal Service, and, of course, that's because that agency is losing $16 billion a year. But no, it didn't show up. And I think actually the reason the labor market is shrinking is because we have made not working pay. We have had a massive expansion in all of the government benefit programs, unemployment insurance, food stamps, disability. Do you know there have been more Americans put on food food stamps and disability under this president than have gotten jobs?
Wow.
That's
amazing.
That's a stunning statistic.
Well, but it's measured. I mean, that's the measure of compassion these days, Steve Moore. I mean, we look at that and we're shocked and we're disgusted by it because we don't see that as the solution for our economy. But those in the administration, I think, and his supporters would say that's a great thing. They're doing what needs to be done.
And you know what? They would actually say that stimulates the economy.
Right.
Remember? They said we're going to expand food stamps and we're going to give people 2 years of unemployment benefits because the more of these welfare benefits we give out, the better the economy does. And I had a column on this about 6 months ago. I said, my 2 sons were back from college, and one of them worked all summer, and the other one sat on his duff watching TV. And the Obama administration, a quote stimulus plan is to take money from my son that was working and give the money to the one who wasn't working. I said, that's not going to create much more jobs in America, at least in the Moore household.
All right, so now when this report came out, initially we said, well, the jobless rate went down, and that was sort of, I think for an instant we thought maybe good news.
Because 500,000 people left the labor force.
And then as we started to get into the numbers, we realized what was really going on. The markets were sort of rattled by this. What's going to happen now?
This economy, look, we're growing at about 2%, and we should be growing at about 4%. I think that all of the other thing we didn't talk about that I think is an enormous weight on the economy. I talk to small business men and women all the time, people on the front lines of the economy. They say they're not hiring right now because of Obamacare.
Well, you're right.
Very, very nervous about that law. They say they're not going to hire more than 50 workers because once you hire more than 50 workers, all of those regulations and tentacles of the Obamacare law take effect. So we're actually encouraging employers to hold back their employment right now. It's craziness.
And in fact, some on Capitol Hill, even Democrats, are concerned because the things that were in Obamacare that were supposed to help small businesses have been delayed for at least a year. So people in small
they have no idea how to deal with this law. They are in a complete state of shock and mystery. And I'll tell you, not only are they not hiring 50 workers, a lot of them are telling me, especially like in the fast food restaurant industry, they're not hiring workers for more than 30 hours a week. So, we're becoming a part-time nation, again, because of these crazy laws. Look, I say this every time I'm on your show, but I'm going to say it again. Mm-hmm. We must repeal Obamacare. It is killing this economy. It's killing our healthcare system. It is not lowering costs. You saw the statistics a couple of weeks ago. A family of 4, premiums now for health insurance, $20,000 a year. This is a crippler.
All right. Listen, thank you so much, Steve, for joining us. Greatly appreciated.
See you guys soon.